Chairman. I want to take off right where Senator Van Hollen left off, that epic debate about where our economy comes from. I mentioned it many times here that regardless of our revenue, our tax rate, our revenues stubbornly stay around 18% of our GDP. One time, and Senator Van Hollen cited it a couple sessions ago, that we did that in the Clinton years to where we were able to raise revenue to the tune of about 20% of our GDP. But statistically, over 50 years, it's around 17.5 to 18%. Kind of as a given, if statistically it's that way, other than 2 years out of 50. So generally, you raise the rates, you flush a little more into the Treasury, but your economic growth rate starts to measurably flatten or go down. When you cut the rates, you take money away from the Treasury, but generally your economic growth rate starts to go up a little bit. It begs the question, is our economy one that can ever be government-centric when the stats seem to show otherwise? And then what do you do with something that's a given? And I want you to address, I'm going to ask two of you to respond to it, Mr. Harris and Mr. Goodspeed. The business plan. When I got here 5 years ago, government had already, due to Republicans and Democrats, gotten into structural trillion-dollar deficits annually. Debated Bernie Sanders on the floor, one of my most enjoyable moments since I've been in the Senate, about the modern monetary theory. Please explain to me the arithmetic once we price the 5 percentage points that interest costs have gone up for everyone, either the government or the private sector. How does that work out? And I remind you that 1% of 30 trillion is 300 billion. Interest rates have gone up 5%, and currently this committee right here, which does nothing on budgeting, is dealing with total discretionary domestic and defense that totals about 1.7 trillion. You know what 5% on 30 trillion would be? That's 1.5 trillion, I believe, in interest costs. We're just beginning, as this debt rolls, to have, along with Medicare Trust Fund going broke in 4 years, that's more government. I am a believer in raising wages and good benefits and helping the people that need it the most, not corporate America. But this looks like a house of cards that there's no way you could grow it into something that would be sustainable. I'm going to start with Mr. Goodspeed, and then I would at least like a minute or two for Mr. Harris to answer as well. Go ahead.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, so I think that to Senator Van Hollen's point about tax expenditures, one of the things that we did in the 2017 tax law was classic tax policy 101. You lower marginal rates to incentivize investment, incentivize labor force participation, and you pay for that in part by closing tax expenditures. So two of the tax expenditures that we closed or limited in 2017 were the deduction for state and local taxes and the mortgage interest deduction. Those are two tax expenditures that cost hundreds of billions of dollars a year and massively skew toward the highest income households. Now, the result of that approach of lowering marginal rates was to increase GDP, the gross output of the U.S. economy, by $300 billion over what the Congressional Budget Office had projected in its final 2016
And it was
forecast.
paying for itself, it looked like to me, right before COVID hit. Would you agree with that in terms of the $150 billion a year that the thing was supposedly costing from the CBO?
I think if you look at the upward revision in the Congressional Budget Office's 10-year forecast, most of that upward revision in growth was attributable to the corporate tax changes. So I can see that the $333 billion in corporate tax changes were likely paying for themselves.
And before you run out of time, what about the idea that we can extrapolate this into the future in terms of what it does in terms of causing a fiscal crisis when we have this much debt now being held by the federal government?
Well, we have this much debt being held by the government, 31% of which matures in less than 1 year. Historically, after 1945, we had a debt to GDP ratio above 100%, but we were also occasionally running budget surpluses, and we had a lot of growth tailwinds.
We were investors and savers then, not consumers and spenders, and there was a work ethic. Mr. Harris.
So I agree with you, Senator, that we do have a long-term fiscal imbalance that does threaten the U.S. economy, in part because we don't know exactly what will happen to interest rates. And if interest rates spike more than they are at the current level, it'll crowd out private investment. So it's a real concern. That's one of the reasons why I've been publicly opposed to the TCJA, is because it costs nearly $2 trillion and would cost more if extended.
Over 10 years, and it used to be 1.5 trillion, but I'll give you the 200 billion a year. That is true chump change. Aren't you more worried about the more global consideration of what running through the Biden administration? They're the only ones that put out a blueprint, $2 trillion deficits as far out as we can see annually. And that's $1 trillion every 6 months. Doesn't that somehow argue against what you're trying to promote through a more, I'm not saying it's perfect in terms of the other system. I don't think it's helping the people that need it the most. I'm not for helping big corporations. I'm for helping the average person on the street. But what we've generated is inflation in debt that no country can sustain. How is that a good long-term business plan?
So I've been encouraged.
Go ahead and answer, but we're well into Senator Kane's time now, so if you could keep it short.
I'll be very brief. I've been encouraged by the Biden administration's anti-deficit proposals, including a proposal to extend the solvency of the Medicare Trust Fund by a generation, largely through changes in prescription drug policy, and also through revenue raisers on corporations and people making more than $400,000.
I'll believe it when I see it and hope that does work, but it looks like we're in trouble as a nation in my mind.
Senator Kane.
Thank you.